Getting started with object-oriented programming requires us to start by creating what's called a class definition, and I've already created our first class definition here. So the keyword class tells Python that we are about to create a class definition, and then the first thing after that is the type of the class. So in this case, we're creating a circle class. And the class you can think about as a template or a blueprint. And that tells it each time you want to create an instance of the circle object, what are the things it should have and what are the things that it can do. So just like a file object can read things from a file, it can close the file, etc., there will be things associated with the circle object like computing the area, etc. Now, to get the circle object initialized with values like the center and radius, we've created what's called a method, and this method is special in that it has this name $_init_. This is called the initialization method, and this tells Python what setup to do when you're initially creating an instance of the circle class from this template or blueprint. And this tells it the reference to the instance that's about to be created, and then you get to provide any additional information that's particular to our particular class here. So in this case, we're parameterizing the circle again by the x and y coordinates of the center and then the radius. And then we'd like to store those within the object. And self, remember, is just the reference to the instance of the class that is calling this method. And then you see the notation self.x equals x. That's taking the input value of x that's being provided when you tell Python you'd like to construct an instance and storing it as a data attribute of this object, and then we just repeat that pattern for the y and r values as well. So given this piece of code, we can go ahead and start Python, and we will provide circle1.py as the file to run and use the -i option to put it in interactive mode. And now we can call help on our circle class, and this will tell us what methods are defined here, and this is where you might go if you needed additional information about how to use your circle class. And if we wanted an instance, we would call the class name as a function and provide the values for the arguments, the x, y, and r. So remember that self is kind of implicitly provided by Python when the initialization method is called, so you don't need to provide an argument for that. Now we have an instance of your circle. We can type C just to print it out. So at this point, there's just a default implementation that prints the string representation of the class definition we're creating, and it just uses kind of this hexadecimal memory address as kind of a default. Not terribly useful unless you're doing low-level debugging, but we'll learn how to replace that later. We can also get access to the data attributes using dot notation. So this is somewhat similar to the dictionary approach of using key value pairs, x, y, and r being the keys, and the corresponding values being the numbers for those parameters. You can also see that we can make changes to the data attributes at this point. So for example, I can change c.r, and we're actually able to replace the value of the data attribute and keep track of information that way. However, it's still not a terribly useful object at this point. So the first thing we'll look at is how to expand the functionality and provide a little bit better documentation. So if we look at the next iteration of the code, you can see it's essentially the same, except that we have done something to make it a little bit more user-friendly, in the sense that instead of just assuming that someone's going to understand X, Y, and R for more complicated scenarios, we can put in this special documentation string, at the beginning of the initialization method, and we can provide a description of what this does, what the values represent, etc. So now if we try to run this code, we're going to go ahead and start Python again. And now when we do help, we see that our help documentation is a little bit more useful because instead of just seeing the prototype for the initialization method and X, Y, and R, we also get that text description of information about this class and what X, Y, and R represent. And again, we can just go ahead and create an instance of this, and at this point we're still just limited to being able to access or store our values as the data attributes via dot notation of .x, .y, and .r.